party. Give you like 30 seconds. And then you can do the introduction and we'll go from there. Right? Sam will cue it up. And welcome back. Is this turned on? Welcome back. Thank you, everybody, for coming back. I'm John Ruppel. I'm one of the faculty members here at the College of Law at the Steiger Center, and it's my pleasure to introduce our noontime speaker, Garrett Eaton. Garrett is an amazing individual. He is a Marine Corps veteran who served in Afghanistan. He came back. He works now as a roughneck in Texas and North Dakota. He's also a river guide for oars. So he guides on the Colorado and on the Green River system. And he offers really what I think is a unique and important perspective on balance in the use of our public lands. And beyond that, he also has really, I think, a profound and powerful insight into the healing power our public lands can have for us as members of the public. So without further ado, I'll turn this over to Garrett. He can introduce his film, Return from Desolation. And Garrett.
Cool, thank you. Thank you. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm thankful that you guys called me and wanted to present our film. It was produced by Oars, the company I work for, the rafting company I work for. They're pretty big. You probably heard of them. They called me out of the blue one day and asked me to be part of a film, and I thought I was just helping, and then the film ended up being about me. Anyway, it's a really good film. There's so many different aspects, the way you can look at it, the way you can take it, but more than anything, just think about how you feel about the environment and how it has affected you, and how it helps you, and just take my story and relate it to yourself. And anyway, enjoy. Got home from Afghanistan and life came at me pretty rough and hard. I was drinking, doing every drug I could do. I didn't think that I could live a few days in a row without alcohol and still be happy. Went to rehab and gained some perspective and learned some tools of recovery and finding real joy and real happiness. And a lot of that for me is these places. Desolation is like the closest you can come to heaven. It's nothing that you can describe. It's something that when you're there, you're there.
Yeah, this is the greatest place ever. I mean, this place saved my life in a lot of ways. Well, actually, it really did save my life. I've seen 100 shrinks. I've taken all the antidepressants and all the bull crap in the world, right? I've taken it all. And until I came down these canyons again and found this emotional release that I have when I'm down here. It's such a place of healing for me, I mean, and without it, I'd be in the ground for sure, or at the bottom of a bottle. When you look at a canyon that's, 2,000 feet above you, and you're just this little guy floating in this river, and it's pushing you where it wants to take you, and you realize that you're just here, and you gotta make the best of it. I don't know how I can even explain it. It's just the greatest place in the world, for me anyway.
Well, first, he was dating my friend, and he had a bad reputation, so I told her that she shouldn't date him because he's kind of a naughty boy. And then he asked me out of the blue one time, and that was it. After that first date, it was over. There was no going back after that. Well, we were engaged in April, and then we got married in July, and then he came home in November and said he joined the Marine Corps.
Yeah, I got an amazing wife. She's been with me through a lot of crap, and I love her. 4 rad kids that are better than I am, or better than I ever thought I could be. Yeah, they're super cool, for sure. Yeah, mouthy as can be, holy crap. They'll tease you, especially if they find a little weakness in you, my little girl. Woo, they'll tease you forever, it's funny.
You guys had to describe your dad in one word that is not bald. What would it be?
Funny. Hilarious, probably. Awesome. Serious. A good salsa maker. He's super strong. And he's handsome.
He's handsome.
He has a nice head.
If I could say anything that represents our family, it's being outside. It's the times where my kids don't fight and we get along and they make up dumb games to pass the time, and that's where our family is the most peaceful.
Been bringing my kids down the river since they were old enough to be on the river, and they've grown up here, and this is like our playground for them and our spiritual place for them. Seeing those kids swimming in the river and camping and painting toenails, you know, on the beach, stuff like that. Priceless, man, priceless, for sure. Energy has always been a catalyst for invention. There wouldn't be computers, there wouldn't be test tubes, there wouldn't be microscopes, there wouldn't be all this stuff that this natural resource that we have in our country provides. Yep. Okay, bye. I'm a company man for an oil company, so I manage a drilling rig from start to finish. Drilling these horizontal Bakken wells here in North Dakota. We need this resource. It's a very powerful resource. It's part of our life, and it's something that we have to come to grips with as environmentalists, that until it changes, this is what we have. We can use this energy to propel us to the next form of energy that's going to power our world. I remember as a kid, I was on a rig, and you could see arches. You know, and I remember just sitting back going, man, do we really need to be here? Is this really an acceptable place to be drilling for oil? I'm like a hippie in the oil field. You know, they totally think I'm a dirtbag hippie. And then I come out here in the river and they're like, oh, this guy's a cool guy. What do you do in the winter? And I'm like, I work on drilling rigs, and I get this. I really feel like sometimes I'm not part of either community.
He talks very little about what happened in Afghanistan with me, like very little. For 15 years or so, he had all this like pent-up anger and confusion of if what he did was even worth it. But after the trip with Stacy Bear, he came back lighter. I think it was empowering to him to realize he wasn't alone.
The Sierra Club sponsors scholarships for veterans to go to guide school. I had the chance to go, and I mean, we met this big burly dude, right, who's kind of standing off in the corner, kind of a frightening individual when you first meet him. It just kind of has a resting "I'm gonna kill you" face, and that was Garrett, and he's awesome. There's nothing about that guy that's not just 100% badassery.
Did a trip with Stacy, and we were talking, and we were, going through our veteran blah, blah, blah bull crap that we do. And I was bitching and moaning about the government and things I didn't agree with and this and that and whatever. And I said, I don't even know what I fought for. And we were sitting in the middle of Split Mountain Canyon, I think it was. He just looks up and he goes, we fought for this, man. This is what we fought for. Every veteran fought for this.
When we go to fight for our country, what we fight for isn't just a philosophy. Democracy and liberty and justice are not abstract values. They have physical representation, and this is it.
I'm very protective of this place. I feel that when I go meet my creator, he's gonna be upset at me if I didn't take advantage and didn't protect and didn't love the thing that he gave me.
With all of my craziness and everything, being a teacher and a full-time mom, and Garrett's gone all the time, I need that reset button just as much. Without those places, our family really wouldn't exist. Through all the pain of the past, of Garrett going to Afghanistan, it's the only solace that I've been able to find and our family's been able to find. It was our healing. It was, now I'm gonna get emotional. It was what saved our family.
The hippies and the rednecks need to come together and figure this stuff out. We have two resources that we're looking at. We're looking at the oil and the gas resource, and then we're also looking at this resource, this beauty that we have. Oil and gas is all over this joint, but this place here, this is special.
We fought for Canyonlands, we fought for Arches, we fought for Dinosaur and Yellowstone and Yosemite and all these places. No place else equalizes us as Americans as the wilderness does.
I would consider Garrett one of my best friends. He doesn't fit in the box that I think a lot of people put a veteran or an outdoorsman or an environmentalist, but he's all those things, and a father and a husband and a friend and a warrior. He's definitely a warrior.
I want my kids, I want my grandkids, I want my great-grandkids to come down here and look at this. I need to know that that's what I've left behind. I'm not a rich guy. I'm not gonna leave them anything, maybe some bills, but I can leave them with the appreciation and the love of this place. And if it's gone, what am I gonna leave them?
Well, thank you, Garrett. You want to take some questions?
Sure.
Great. So if you have questions, feel free to use the Slido app, and we'll set them up for Garrett.
Got home from Afghanistan, and life came at me pretty rough and hard.
I think the first comment this person speaks for all of us when they say, thank you for your service and for finding joy in life. So thank you.
Thanks. So I get a lot of that thank you for your service stuff, and I really appreciate it, and I think it's awesome. I think all of us veterans appreciate it. I was in a meeting kind of like this, and there was a guy there. His name's Doug Peacock, and he was a veteran, the grizzly guy. I don't know if you know him. I'm going to totally mess this quote up, but what he said was, someone asked him, what did fighting in Vietnam do for you, or something like that. He said, you know what? I'm glad I went to Vietnam. I'm glad I fought in Vietnam because it taught me what I needed to know about the real fight, and the real fight's for our environment here in America and on the world, you know. So when people tell me thank you for your service, I really appreciate it, because that gave me the fight that I need, that gives me the determination to continue fighting for our environment. And so when you say thank you for your service, what I really would like is for you guys and for everyone else to put their shoulder to the wheel and start helping and start doing things to you know, help our environment, help our public lands, help our people, help save the grizzly bears and the canyons and all these things that we have. That's what we need. We did our duty. We went to Afghanistan and Vietnam and all these things, and we fought. We need help, you know, fighting for what else is left, you know, that we can't do. So.
Garrett, you talked about being a kind of having a foot in each world, as a hippie and as a bit of a redneck. Mm-hmm. From your experience, what are the ways to bridge those communities? How do we get those groups talking to each other and working together towards a common goal?
I think that once we realize that we all have a common goal is when that happens, you know. I mean, all the people that I know in Vernal and in the oil and gas industry, they all like to go camping, they like to go hunting. I've met people part of different groups that are all really just enjoy being outside. And once we figure out that we all just really enjoy being outside, then once we decide that we have a common goal, then we can go towards that common goal, I think.
What do you hope your family and maybe the rest of us here can take away from your life experiences and from your perspective?
You know, I just want people to know how helpful the environment is and how wonderful these places are that we have and how much they help all of us. My story is not very uncommon. I guarantee that there's people in this room that's been healed because of where they've been. You know, they've sat around campfires with their family. They've been on hikes with their grandparents. They've done things that every one of us goes back to and remembers those things. And if we weren't at those places and seeing the things that we saw while we were there, we wouldn't have those memories. And without those memories, we don't really have a life. You know, we don't have happiness or joy. And without that, what do we have? So.
Can you talk a little bit about the Green River and your experience there? I mean, you've guided on Deso, you've guided on the Gates of Lador, you've been on Niampa. What are the threats that you see to those river systems?
Mostly, you know, the threats that we have, I mean, there's the big ones. There's the big, you know, fight over the Colorado water and what they're going to do with that. But the threats that I see as a river guide are when people show up on the river and they think it's acceptable to throw water bottles on the ground, and they think it's acceptable to, you know, throw trash and do things like that. I think that the grassroots where we are, you know, as river guides, we're kind of like the boots on the ground of environmentalism. We teach those things like, hey, pick up your trash. Hey, that's not good for the environment. Hey, you got to pee in the river and you got to poop in the groover and things like that. That, you know, everybody sees the big picture stuff, but I see the small stuff. I see the small, you know, people, you know, squirting their suntan lotion on the grass, and you know, it's different things like that. So for me, what I see is the little things that just everyday humans need to work on. Everybody needs to understand is what they need to do. You know, the big things are big and they're great, and I'm happy that there's people, you know, watching out for that stuff. But I think for me, it's just the small things.
You know, what we see sometimes depends on where we sit and the people that are around us. And I think those of us that live here in Salt Lake City or other more urban areas, our life experience, our perspective is quite a bit different from those in rural communities. What are the takeaways that we here in the urban center need to understand more about rural communities?
Wow. You know, I get, as a river guide, we get people from all over the world coming down the river, and we live together for 5 to 15 days, and I learn a lot about you city folk. And you know, I grew up thinking that you guys were city people who didn't know anything about, you know, surviving in the wilderness and know about, you know, you guys knew how to shop and stuff like that. But come to find out, you guys pretty smart. You guys come out in the wilderness and everybody knows, and they want to learn. And just like what we were talking about, the hippies and the rednecks, the city folk and the rural people, they just love being outside too. And they love, you know, seeing these things and doing things outside and being there. And I think really we're all just want to be outside. We all just want to see that stuff and go hiking and watch our kids play in the dirt and whatnot. So yeah, it's just something that we just all really need to see, that we all just want to be happy, you know. So we're all the same.
Do you have any more thoughts on how we can bridge that gap? How we bring those different communities together, where it's whether it's urban, rural, whether it's hippie, redneck? You know, how do we get people into a common place where we can have those discussions? And you seem like you have a great opportunity with the river trip. What are the other mechanisms that we can use?
Yeah, I would say number one, river trip, but nothing's going to get you together like being down there for 20 days. But I really just think that education is the big thing. I think our kids are getting smart. I think they always were smart, but I think teaching them different things than how am I going to say this? Teaching them that we're all together, you know, and getting people together, just getting people together. I mean, I've seen people, you know, you hear the story about after the Glen Canyon Dam was built and David Brower went down the river with the Bureau of Rec guy. I can't remember his name.
Floyd Dominy.
Yeah. And they did the river trip and they went down the Glen Canyon before it filled up. And they talk about how they were in such disagreement, but when they got down there, they started to see each other's point of views, you know. And I think being cool, calm, and collected, and just talking with people is where we need to be. It's so scary to just talk politics with people anymore, let alone how you feel about the environment. That it's just time to just chill out, you know, and talk it through, and instead of disliking somebody for what you perceive them to be, you know, kick back and look at that farmer and understand why he wants his water rights, and understand why this guy who likes to go hunting, why, you know, put yourself in his shoes, you know, put yourself in everybody's shoes, and once that happens, then we'll all start getting along. I know that sounds crazy and hippie and blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's really it, I think, you know.
And how do you make that happen? I mean, you have a unique perspective. As a river guide, you're talking to your colleagues about working in a gas patch, working in the oil field, about, you know, drilling. Mm-hmm. But then when you go and work on a rig, you're talking to those folks about the tofu-eating, tree-hugging liberals like me. So how do you start those conversations? How do you make that happen? How do you break down those barriers, those initial defenses to having that kind of discussion?
Right. So for me, I drive a Subaru, and I drive it out to the rig, and I got stickers all over it, and everybody else has got their big jacked up trucks, and that's what starts my conversation. Yeah, you know, I come pulling up, and they start talking to me, and they're like, "Why is this guy from Utah? What's going on?" You know, and I'm like, "Hey, you know, what do you do on your time off?" And they're like, "Oh, well, we go camping, we go shooting our guns, and we go do this stuff." I'm like, "Oh, you know, those dirtbag hippies, that's what they do too. You know, they go camping, they drink beer, they drink coffee in the morning, and they look at the beauty, and they enjoy it, just like you, you know." And so the oil and gas people, they go, "They do?" I'm like, "Yeah, they do. They just like the same stuff as you do, you know." And they're like, "Oh yeah," and same with the liberals, you know. I mean, they think that we're out there, all of us are out there, you know, killing sage grouse for fun, and you know, and that's not happening, you know. And so for those people to understand that we love it too, and we want to take care of it too, and we're not just out there trying to, you know, do harm, you know. So yeah, it's just a conversation. That's all it is, and everybody feels the same, really.
Okay.
I don't know anybody in the oil gas that goes, "Man, I really wish we could fill up the Grand Canyon with some water," you know, and I don't know any liberals that, you know, wish that we didn't have any fuel to, you know, put in our cars. You know, we all agree. We just don't agree that we agree, I guess.
Okay. Can you talk to us a little bit about North Dakota? I mean, you made a comment about some places being too special to drill. How do we decide what places are appropriate for drilling? And what's your take on the Bakken and drilling, whether the Pinedale Anticline in Wyoming, or how do we get to that point? How do we decide?
So I've drilled in all those spots in Pinedale and everywhere. I think what I would talk about in the film is that we need to use what we have right now to project us into the next form of energy. You see a lot of things where we're using solar panels and stuff like that, and so I think that we need to wean ourselves off of the oil and gas. And I think that's really the answer to it, because eventually we're going to be crowding into these places we shouldn't be. I don't know what to say, what's more special or what's not, because there's places in North Dakota that's absolutely beautiful. Drilling next to the Missouri River in the Wyoming or the Yellowstone and all those beautiful places. I mean, you guys saw pictures of it. It's beautiful up there. Everywhere we go is beautiful. West Texas has some pretty places too. But yeah, the thing that we need to do is quit arguing about this stuff and start figuring stuff out. Obviously what we're doing is not working. It's not going to continue to work, and without education and change for the future, we're just going to be spinning our wheels on the same. We're going to be having this conversation 20 years from now, when really 20 years from now we should be having a conversation about, wow, 20 years ago we were stupid, you know what I mean? Instead of the same one over again.
Mm-hmm. Let's change direction a little bit. Let's go back to the river. Have you had the opportunity to lead trips with a lot of other veterans? How do those compare to other trips? And what have you experienced in getting veterans out on the river?
Oh, wow. Yeah, we do Sierra Club veterans trips, and they're amazing. Let me tell you how they go, and this might be the best way to explain this. Day one, everybody shows up, and if you've been around veterans, they all think they're tough. No one can mess with them. You know what I mean? And so everybody shows up with their stuff, and everybody's just kind of like, ooh, we're tough veteran guys, whatever. Day one, they go through their first rapid, and you get to see a little bit of fear in their eyes, and you see, Then, that first night, everybody's kind of nervous. We've made them dinner, and then it goes on, and you see this breakdown of these men and women with these really severe mental and emotional problems, and they show up on the river, and they are so guarded, and they're so ready to just. Most of them don't even want to be there. We call it day 3, night 3 magic, and it's after you've been down there for a while, you've disconnected from the world, you haven't had a cell phone for a few days, you start seeing things, you start letting your emotions out, and day 3, I've seen the toughest men that I know crying their eyes out and telling me stuff about how they haven't been out of their basement for 3 years, and their wives made them come, and they've changed their lives. And I've seen men and women alike that have just completely changed their lives. 6 months later, they're emailing me, hey, Garrett, I got my first job that I haven't had because I haven't been able to freaking come out of my house. The emotional change that happens to those guys, and to everybody, really. I mean, this story is the same for every river trip. People just emotionally change. Like the molecules in your body change after you've been down there for 3 or 4 days, and you've let the wilderness just change you. And so, yeah, the emotional help and the mental help and the physical help that the wilderness and the canyons, for me, the canyons provide are unmatched. There's nothing else that can fix you like that and fixes those people. I can't explain it. It's something you have to see. It's a miracle. I guess is how I can say.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap this up pretty quick, but I want to end on a question from Scott. ultimately, rural folks are going to have to run for office. Do you ever think about running for county commissioner? Or legislature?
Yeah, Vernal needs some help. We're working on that, so I don't know.
Sounds like a non-decision.
Yeah.
We'll work on the exploratory campaign or exploratory committee for you.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I definitely would think about it. Definitely want to do things to help our community. I feel like, just like I said, the small things, that's what we need help with, you know.
Okay.
But I appreciate you guys having me here. I really do. It's been awesome. I'm super honored to be around people like you. You guys are amazing, amazing human beings, and I'm truly, truly humbled to be here. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to focus in on, take some of the broad lessons we've had from this morning, talking about public lands writ large, about some of the challenges with public land law that Rebecca Watson introduced us to, and some of the economic concerns that Ray Rasker talked about. And we're going to look at some of those issues through the lens of Moab. So an area that I think everybody in this room is probably pretty familiar with, and if you're like me and you've been down there for the last 10, 20, 25, 30 years, it's changed dramatically. So I'll be really brief here. We're going to have 4 speakers on this next panel. We'll start with Clif Koontz, the Executive Director of Ride with Respect. Then we'll have Ashley Korenblat, who is the CEO of Western Spirit Cycling and a member of the Mountain Bike Hall of Fame. Then Emily Niehaus, the mayor of Moab, and John Steiger, who recently retired as the regional solicitor for the U.S. Department of Interior, which includes the BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, and National Park Service, among others. So they will bring their perspectives to bear on the situation in Moab. So, Clif, why don't you start us off?
Thank you very much. Just want to make sure that I'm queued up here. There we go. So, I appreciate the Quincy College of Law and all of the audience members for hearing another perspective here. I thought that was a great segue. The last presentation really made space for looking at things from the dark side, which is motorized recreation. My name is Clif Koontz. I'm Executive Director of Ride with Respect, based in Moab. We're going to discuss off-highway vehicles, OHVs. It's another TLA, 3-letter acronym. OHVs refers to dirt bikes or motorcycles. ATVs or quads, side-by-sides or UTVs, 4-wheel drives or Jeeps, generally on public lands in the West. And let's see if, I figured it out. There was only 2 choices, so I'd have 50-50 chance. Basically, we at Ride with Respect conserve shared use trails of the motorized kind. We've been doing that since 2002 and accumulated nearly 20,000 hours of service on mostly BLM, but also Forest Service, state lands. But first I want to explain how I would associate with people that are toppling balanced rocks. Actually, I found that rock and I asked my friend to pose as if she were trying to put it back up, but it didn't come out right. And the real shame is that I had ridden by that pinnacle or balanced rock many times and never gotten a picture of it. And I don't know if anyone else had. But basically, I grew up doing other things, even backpacking, mountain biking, never bike packing, this combination that's shown here. And I'm not sure I have the spine for it anymore. But you know, I'm open to it. But I was also open to specifically motorcycle trail riding, and I could see right away the potential for problems. You know, the motorcycle has as much as 50 horsepower at the flick of a wrist, and so it takes a higher level of responsibility than a lot of activities. But I wanted to figure out if that could be managed successfully and sustainably. And basically, what appealed to me personally was if you imagine downhill mountain biking, there's flow involved and there's so much attention required. You can't really be thinking of the stupid things that occupy most of your day. But then, of course, there's the uphill. Unless you get a shuttle vehicle or a gondola, you are going to be thinking on the ride up. Well, on a motorcycle, it's like everything's the downhill. Even the uphills are downhills because it's consistent as long as you're on a technical trail. You'll actually get some exercise and that sense of flow. And I mean, it takes you to these places like the downhill mountain biking might have a beautiful run from the top of the LaSalle Mountains down to the Colorado River, but it's just one, you know. So it's not that I expect to go everywhere on a dirt bike, but man, you know, the options are fortunately widespread. And for this presentation, I'm going to focus on an area closer to Green River. So let's see if I can figure out the pointer. So Moab is down below the map. That's the Moab airport. That's the town of Green River. And here we have Ruby Ranch, where people put in for Labyrinth Canyon, that starts just a little way south of Ruby Ranch. And so it's this Dubinki trail system, but really this part south and east of Ruby Ranch, because it's some of the best trails and also some of the most likely for us to lose access. Of course, both of those statements are debatable. But it's called Dubinki because, well, even though you started like in World War II, the innovation of Jeeps and motorcycles that went off-road, so to speak, it really picked up in the 70s, and there was a race annually there called the Dubinki Steel Run, where they would go from Green River to the Dubinki Well and take a swig of whiskey, maybe just to fulfill the stereotype of the sport, but then they would race back, and that went on through the 80s. But I'm going to try to structure this with the 4 E's of management from Novak. Basically, Novak is the National Off-Highway Vehicle Conservation Council that helps train volunteer riders and even managers about the activity. But I'm going to add an E before we even start with the 4 E's. Here's a 5th E, and that is the experience. So it's important to provide ample opportunities for quality and quantity of experiences, OHV riding. You know, otherwise you're trying to fit a 10-gallon hat into a 5-gallon bucket. But it's also important for the experiences to be had by the land manager, to understand where the rider is going to be coming from. These BLM staff understand why those cables need to be yellow or bright in color anyway, because at speed they're easy to miss, although maybe we should work on a better design that's a little bit less neon. In any case, they're fluent in OHVs. They don't actually ride trails on their own time, and that's okay, but they understand. Okay, so evaluation is the first D, and all of you, I mean, some of you are more qualified than me at a lot of this basic management, and so I'll go through this part rather quickly, but this is monitoring documentation, identifying the changes, whether that's acceptable level of change and whether something should be done about it. And enforcement is another E that a little bit goes a long way because law enforcement officers are expensive, but just the idea that there's a chance of getting caught will help for the few that need that. And of course, if it's 1% of 2 million visitors, then that's a lot of people. But here, I'm actually setting up a camera to try to identify a vandal. And you know, if I need to go to social media or actual proper law enforcement, I can do that. But usually, it's education that is the bigger bang for your buck. Here's some old info that might have worked in the 90s, but it needs to be updated, not just the condition of it, but really the content, you know, to be drawing people in their interest, because otherwise they're just going to ride by. Informative, what they're looking for with the map, but then also persuasive with the basic tread lightly or other trail ethic minimum impact practices. How's my audio, by the way? Is this too loud or not loud enough? It's good. Okay. So, of course, it's better to educate in person. And, you know, that's where I see a lot of the field crews, you know, if they're doing physical work, anytime they see somebody, they stop. If they're on a motorcycle, the rider's, or ATV, the rider's going to have a greater level of respect already. And then if they're doing work that helps the trail infrastructure or even the natural resource conditions, you know, that's appreciated, and it's a better starting point for a conversation than just patrolling on its own, I think. And education can be very basic, setting the expectations. Hey, if you're trying to get through, this isn't the road for you. From the beginning of the intersection. And then once you get to the end of the road, this is the end of the road, because otherwise it'll basically, I'm thinking propagate, but I know there's another word for it, migrate. Anyway, and now we're kind of blending between education and trail work. It can get complex. Here's a simple version, but the complex is like the cattle guard. You know, it's. I have 5 minutes left. Oh my gosh. So it's got to be the right specs, or otherwise people or cattle can get hurt. And we delineate routes. You know, just the corridor of it, where it's not clear. We work on the tread of the route, the trail surface itself, to harden or stabilize or clear. We try to use the best design, which is similar to a lot of the mountain bike, just it has to handle more wear and tear. But you know, this entrance is in a rougher area than it really needs to be. It's pretty wide open country there, but that sets the stage. This is single track. It's not an ATV trail. It's difficult. If you're a novice, pick a different route. It's not a good place for racing your buddies side by side. And when we go downhill, we aim uphill periodically to drain the water. But we do so in a sort of predictable manner for that flow to keep the water off the trail, but the people on the trail. And this is a big factor in the outcome that's missed a lot of times. Like you'll probably hear about some of the mountain biking trail development 150 miles around Moab. That is partly in great shape because there's less wear and tear than the motorcycles, but it's largely because of that design. These are trails that were made for recreation for generations. the mining roads were just made to get from point A to point B for whatever period of time they needed to do their exploration. And we're trying to fix those. Or they might be following cattle trails or a user-created trail that was hopefully made back when the area was open to cross-country travel. Here's a reroute that we did, because sometimes a segment of an old trail, it's got to be moved from, in this case, a spring that's used by bighorn sheep. And so this is right in that same area, just a few years later. I think 2. Anyway, you can hardly see the trail on the lower left. It's already grown back, and we brought them up top where it's harder ground as well. And this was a cultural site. We again brought them up higher where there's nothing buried. This was riparian and also social, along the river, bringing them up away from the river. And this was 2 years later. It's working. This is the other end of it, where the swing fence has to allow the floods to go through, and proper design on the new route. And you see they're braiding because there's whoops or moguls that develop, and so you can groom those. But if you're in a really far out spot, better to just move the trail to a rocky area with all of these explanations, why we're doing it, what the alternatives are. It's so much more successful when you have a place, in this case for the ATVs and the full-size vehicles, to get from point A to point B. And it develops a sense of stewardship, because we have invested in this area, so we finish after dark and we still pick up trash that after I brought it to the transfer station, I realized, that might have been over 50 years old, but there's nothing I could do about it at that point. We'll add a dozen bags of concrete to keep things in place. We'll help close a road that was not claimed by the county. We'll help close a road that was claimed by the county with the county's blessing, if it makes sense in the larger scheme, because we know there's a place for us. And finally, will support our land managers publicly with these decisions. But the reason why I chose that one area was to show you where the rubber meets the road. That spot, which isn't by any means all the trails, but it's probably the best trails. It also overlaps where the America's Red Rock Wilderness Bill is located, as well as the Greater Canyonlands monument campaign of several years ago, everything south of that purple line there. And so it's not as if these things need to just go away. We need people to defend access. We need people to defend the natural resources and also the other social resources besides OHVs. But there is obviously balance point there, and I think institutions like this are a good place to hopefully start figuring that out in a more constructive way. So thank you very much for your time.
Hi everyone, is the chocolate brownie still working? My name's Ashley Korenblat. I'm an outfitter. I do bicycle trips on the public lands all around the country, and my coffee call is not as good as yours. And a few years ago, we started a nonprofit, and it's called Public Land Solutions. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what Public Land Solutions does. I'm going to give you a very brief history of public land attitudes, and then talk a little bit about the evolution of Moab. Right, it's a 50-50 chance. Okay, so what Public Land Solutions does is we work with stakeholders. We're primarily really involved right now in helping communities that want to pivot from dependence on resource extraction, oil, gas, and coal, to recreation. Like we have a big project in Farmington, New Mexico, where their coal-fired power plant is scheduled to close in 2022, and the region could lose as many as 1,800 jobs. So the way that we do it is we do what's called a recreation audit. And that looks at all the recreation opportunities in a region and where they stand and what's going on with them. We do a lot of work which is really similar to what Clif is doing, thinking about managing experiences, not just polygons, right? So for a long time, we sort of make a polygon on a map and say, here's the rules in that polygon. So we're moving towards a time where we're really looking at how do we manage the experiences. And once you look at it that way, it does change the amount of land that you need, what you're trying to do, and then what is the recreation asset that you're trying to develop. And then we look at public-private partnerships. So what we're seeing is prosperous communities share a variety of characteristics, but the main one that we're seeing more and more is this opportunity to get outside. And so what is a recreation asset? We're really defining it as anything that gets somebody outside, out of their car. So as Ray pointed out in way better detail, there's lots of information out there about how big the recreation economy is growing and how fast it's growing and how big it is. But when you really look into this, a lot of millennials and folks coming into the job market now, they're looking for quality of life. And there's more and more data about that. And when you think about what does that mean for the out of doors and what does that mean for communities and companies. So we're seeing this interest in various rural communities that are looking at, so how are we going to come up with another 1,800 jobs in Farmington? When they first called us and said, we have this problem, our coal-fired power plant is closing, can you help us? We need you to help us create 1,800 jobs by 2022. I was like, who gave you my number? So it's a non-trivial challenge, but part of what we're seeing is that it has to do with the brand of the community. So, for example, if you have a company in the Bay Area in California and you move to Boulder, Colorado, did you really solve anything? Your employees still can't afford to buy a house and everyone's stuck in traffic, right? But if you live somewhere like Cortez, Colorado, where Osprey Pax is located, it's one of the places where, as an entry-level job in the outdoor industry, you can actually buy a house. And so what's happening is, and this has always been the case, but as a company, your address is part of your brand. So in the communities that are really working hard to sort this out and attract not just visitors, but also quality of life recruits, and including the retirees and every category of folks to their community as a mechanism for some steady economic development. Now, we all know what happens when it gets out of control. We're going to get to that. But for the moment, there are a lot of communities that are really, it's not even close to out of control, and they're really looking at how do we sustain our community? How do we avoid the bust that is facing us with resource extraction? Okay, so I just want to talk a minute about why public land is so divisive and everyone gets so angry. And here are a couple of things that have come through with the work that we do. So for most of human history, right, land ownership was the best way to generate wealth. If you own the land, your family is getting wealthier and wealthier. So Emily, for example, is the Duchess and her family is getting wealthier. I'm the peasant, my family has nothing, right? And then all of a sudden we move to America and so there's going to be land for everybody. All of our children can have land. We got plenty of land. Yeah, well, some of it didn't get homesteaded. It didn't get settled. Maybe because it was hard to grow vegetables on a cliff or many other reasons about the remoteness of it all. So when the agencies were created around the turn of the century, imagine if your family was out here in Utah and you are surviving, like you're kind of a badass, right? And so then these agency folks show up and they say, well, we're in charge. So it kind of started off on a bad note, right? And what I see in a lot of, Congressman Bishop said just the other day that the Green New Deal is genocide for the rural West. What? So to me, that's just kind of showing that where he is right now is in a 19th century place, where for him, the federal land ownership is what's prohibiting the citizens of Utah from generating wealth and doing well. So, but as we were talking about just a minute ago, what we're seeing, the data is showing, what Ray showed us is that the data is showing that communities that have access to shared public land are prospering. And so that is a huge pivot, right? To go from thinking that private land ownership is the best thing to understanding the value of public land. It's a big pivot that we're asking folks to do. And that's some of the work that we're doing is working in that space, because in Farmington anyway, no one is arguing that oil and gas is going to save the day. But in other places, there appears to be a choice, even when in reality there may not. That opportunity to continue dependence on resource extraction may not even be a choice, but the attitude is still there. So, okay, back to Moab. So in Moab, it started with resource extraction roads. The White Rim Trail in Canyonlands National Park was put there to look for uranium, and that was one of the first places where recreation of all types started to happen. So I want to do a little case study about mountain biking and conservation. So when I first moved to Moab, I was the chair of the International Mountain Bicycling Association. And I learned about the work of SUA, the work that they were doing to protect the public land. And several things happened at once. First, my colleagues in the bike community were like, well, they must be the enemy. And I was like, actually, no. They're helping us protect the places where we ride. And then there was this conversation about, well, where are the trails and where are the places they want to protect? And people were pretty overwhelmed by the data. And at one point someone said, we should figure this out. We should figure out where it is. And people were like, well, it will cost $300 just to buy all the maps. I'm like, I'll donate for the maps. So we bought the maps and we did the work and we looked at it. And it isn't perfect. But if you look at the way the recreation evolved in Moab, the brown is the Red Rock Wilderness Act. And if you look at this map, okay, I'm going to try the pointer, maybe, possibly. Clif, how'd you do it? Oh, there we go. I got it. Okay. So these spaces in here are where we built a lot of the trails. So there is and that was very deliberate. I mean, that was part of the 2008 RMP, and it was very much. And when you look at, if you start talking about managing experiences instead of polygons, it turns out that for most day mountain bike rides, people do need to get back to their car. You know, it's not the same type of exploration that people used to do in the past in recreation. At this point, people want to have the experience they're expecting. A big part of managing recreation involves managing people's expectations. Okay, so that kind of set us up for the Moab Master Leasing Plan. So this was a moment where, at the end of the Bush administration, there were lots of leases, oil and gas leases that had been deferred based on the discretion of the BLM. And when Mr. Bush was leaving office, he said, well, we should release those. And the state office here at that time said, okay, we'll release all of them. And there were parcels that had been nominated that were in the Moab Aquifer. There were parcels on the Porcupine Rim Trail, one of the most important bike trails in Moab. I mean, it was kind of like big wake-up call. And at that time, we knew there was a lot of lands leased, but those particular parcels, we found out that we didn't have any rights as a mountain biker or as a permit holder. That the oil and gas system, the companies had nominated the parcels, and it was the BLM's prerogative to let them go to auction. So when the Obama administration came around, they came up with this tool called the Master Leasing Plan, which is basically just looking at where the trails are, looking at where the conservation values are, and trying to figure out where there should be no surface occupancy. And while it was a long process, we were able to save about 500,000 acres, and those are the core of the recreation assets that serve Moab right now. So then I'm fast forwarding to Love to Death, right? And we've been talking about that a lot today. And this is just the recent headlines from the Arches Reservation System, which everyone is in a full panic about. And it turns out that the $11 to $22 million is about growth. It would be a decrease in growth. But I have the study compared this to regulatory uncertainty and not public management uncertainty. And it's a little crazy because the whole purpose of a reservation is to give you certainty. So I think we're going to be working hard on this, and this problem is throughout the country. I mean, one of my guides, really nice guy, last year almost got in a fist fight with a ranger at Glacier over a parking spot. So it's a huge problem. We have to find a way to make it work. And most of the idea behind the reservation system is to spread out the use over the day. So right now nobody can get out of the house because they didn't get the good coffee call, right? And they all show up at 10 or 11. But if you had a reservation at 9, you would be there. So I remain really optimistic about this and think it is really important. So I just want to talk a minute about other communities outside of Utah that are getting after it. In Bentonville, Arkansas, Walmart at one point, that's Walmart's headquarters, they were thinking about, they were having trouble recruiting executives to live in Northwest Arkansas. Well, two of the Walton grandsons are really into mountain biking. They've spent something like $7 million building trails in Bentonville, and now everybody wants to live there. And what that's doing is it's making these places, some of which were sort of quasi-public, suddenly those are public recreation assets that the whole community wants to protect in its natural state. So it's a really interesting evolution. And then Farmington, I mentioned, Farmington's got a lot of great things going on New Mexico has some great things going on right now because they are not stuck with the 19th century ideas. They're ready to move on. Their leadership is ready to move on, and they're taking the steps. And there are communities in New Mexico and Colorado and places where that's happening that could really eat our lunch in Utah if we aren't careful, because if the dialogue in Utah is so focused on Mr. Bishop's views versus, I guess that makes him the redneck and I'm the hippie, but whatever. So, and then Fruita, Colorado is another place that was completely saved by the recreation economy. So what does it mean for the future? What are we gonna, how are we gonna fund it? And there's been some talk about that and how are we gonna plan for the future? And just this morning, I think that we should treat conservation and recreation just like we do all the other government services that we need as a society. We need sanitation, we need police, we need economic development, we need places to get outside, and we need land to be conserved. So for me, we need to work this into the federal budget and the state budgets and the local budgets. Like this idea that even though I know it will be hard, I think that should be our future. And because these issues are mainstream, you know, the way that we need to do that is going to be policy changes, things like the MLP and the de-siloing tourism from the product, right? Working on public land issues. But the main thing is to fund it. And this wasn't my idea, but I really like it. Let's make funding recreation and conservation part of the Green New Deal.
Are we sleepy? Because I don't have a PowerPoint. Should we stand up for a second and wiggle? Thank you. It's just as much for me as it is for you. All right, sit back down. What do you think we're doing here? Settle down, settle down. My name is Emily Niehaus. I am the mayor of Moab. And raise your hand if you think that there's a cooler job out there than mayor of Moab. A funny thing about mayor of Moab, the acronym is MOM, Mom. And if you've seen a 10-year-old running around, that's my son Oscar. Thanks for letting him be here. I wanted to give a little bit of background about me and about Moab to start off with. So I grew up in Ohio and found myself in graduate school at Clemson University. I have my degree in applied sociology. My master's thesis project, my thesis, was environmental attitudes and behaviors among whitewater recreationists. So I was able to do statistics and paddle whitewater. And shout out to Desolation Canyon. It is my family's very favorite place to recreate. Also, when I was in graduate school, I got really interested in gender as a variable, being a young woman and realizing that women, and this was 2002, women like me were recreating because we had a brother, a father, or a boyfriend that got us outside. Because of a lot of great programs, that's changed. Hashtag not there yet, but we're getting there, and so I was lucky to have that educational experience. I graduated, moved to Bryce Canyon National Park. I was offered a job to wear the flat hat and work for the Park Service. And I was also charged with the opportunity to do an evaluation of their shuttle system, which failed. And the reason for the failure was because it was implemented the same year as the Parks Pass, the National Parks Pass. And the superintendent had planned revenue based on entrance fee, but people showed up the same year that the shuttle system was implemented and flashed their Parks Pass and didn't pay to enter Bryce Canyon because Bryce is not a first park. And so the parks didn't get back from the federal government their share of attendance, or so the shuttle system failed. So it's interesting that was my first job in Utah. Then I received another proposal, which was move to Moab and marry me. So, and it was like a dual proposal. It was like, you're not just marrying me, you're also marrying Moab. So I said, okay, with a master's degree, what am I going to do? So I worked for a rafting company, and I worked as a caseworker for the state of Utah, using some of my sociology degree. I worked as a loan officer for a credit union because when I was a caseworker, I saw an affordable housing need in Moab. I saw a lot of trailers that had been brought to Moab because of the uranium boom. And so there was a need for affordable housing. It didn't sit right with me. I figured, figure out how to pay for it and maybe get into lending. Did that for a while. Got a job after that because I didn't have any business experience with Western Spirit Cycling, with Ashley as my business mentor for 4 years. And then through all of that, launched a nonprofit called Community Rebuilds, building affordable housing with low-income families through a student education program. And the housing typology is straw bale construction. So that's a lot about me, and sometimes people say, well, what do you have to do to become mayor? What's the qualifications? So there's some of that. But here's a little bit about Moab. So Moab was incorporated in 1902. In the 50s, we had the uranium boom. In the 70s, we had the mining bust. We had leftover infrastructure from uranium mining, including single-wide trailers. that were always meant to be temporary housing. It's interesting that the bust happened on the tails of the Wilderness and Wild and Scenic and the Land and Conservation Acts. So maybe that's part of Moab's story. Because what happened also was the leadership at the time in Moab said, okay, well, we're hungry, we're eating venison and beans in the winter time. We need to make money, we need to figure out how we can, we need to figure out economic development in Moab. And so they got organized and they focused on tourism. And I want to point out a couple of things that they did because there were no jobs. A couple of things that they did that led to unintended consequences. So the first was they converted apartments into nightly rentals. There weren't a lot of hotels back then in Moab, and they needed places for visitors to live. So they converted apartments to hotels, thinking that that was a really good idea. And then they also fought for the state to create a funding mechanism to support tourism and to support it specifically through advertising. And so this group of people that wanted to promote tourism also pushed forward this policy work to fund that advertisement. I bring up those 2 points because they really lead to, then we had 2013's Mighty Five campaign, and here we are today with a lot of unintended consequences of a tourism-based economy, of being a gateway community. I just want to say, tourism is not the villain. We're responding, and we're not organized right now to, we're still responding. Vicki, I don't know if you're here. If you're still here, I'm looking for your bright yellow jacket. Hi, Oscar. When she was showing the videos earlier today, Chad and I were kind of cringing. We were nervous. Videos like that make us nervous. We need a little breathing room to get organized. And a lot of Moabites, which I should probably give a shout out to the Moabites in the room. Yeah, we're like, should we keep advertising or can we use that money? Is that money better spent on infrastructure to support tourism? This is a serious debate that we're having in Moab. And this is a serious debate that all emerging tourism communities are going to have, if not prepared. So my hot topic list of these resulting from unintended consequences, housing, of course. Housing is a crisis everywhere, right? There's no community that's not trying to figure out housing, right? But in Moab, land is so expensive because it's so pretty and everybody wants to live there. And the jobs that come with tourism don't necessarily align economically with the cost of land. So it's a real struggle. Housing affordability is a real struggle. The sewer treatment plant. When do you ever think that's going to be such a hot topic? A failing sewer is problematic, but when you're a town or a city of 5,000 people, or the county is 10,000 roughly, and you're supporting up to 5 million visitors, you have to deal with a lot of stuff. a lot of sewer. And so when I was at lunch, I was actually walking with my plate of food and I heard someone say, "Oh yeah, and did you hear that Moab got a new sewer system?" I was like, we're famous for that. So sewer is a real hot topic. Healthcare. So my friend, Jen, who's the CEO, did a presentation yesterday. $4 million annually, her business is losing in uncompensated care. So that's poverty, that's international travelers. If you were running a business and you had a $4 million loss annually, you'd kind of freak out, right? And that's just another unintended consequence of a rural community dealing with the impact of tourism. And then also another fun topic, waste hauling. It's one thing to worry about recycling just on a personal level, but think about tons of visitors coming that are not coming from a kitchen, that are bringing a lot of disposable things, and then you're trying to recycle it, and then the community's like, oh, recycling's complicated anyway, and we're so rural, and all of our recycling is meant to go to Denver, and it's complicated. Who would have thought waste hauling could be so complicated and so controversial, but yet another unintended consequence of a tourism-based economy. So, how do we deal with all of this visitation? Moab City, another thing that we did back when we were promoting tourism and people were broke, we got rid of our property tax. So Moab City's primary funding source is sales tax, TRT, the tax, the bed tax, taxing T-shirts, taxing lodging. That's what supports Moab City, which can kind of be a scary reality when you're looking at a budget, and when you're thinking about things like a reservation system that could adversely affect your budget. We've got so much impact. If we were to lose that revenue that we do have, trouble. So there's that, I really appreciated this morning's presentation about possible funding sources. I think that social impact funding is a real thing that can help communities like Moab. The Sorensen Impact Center here in Salt Lake does a conference every year, and it's very inspiring because we have to think about how we're going to pay for this tourism more than we're already paying with overcrowding. Private business needs to step up. Policy has to follow. There's a movement to try to collect sales tax, like a TRT tax, on federal campsites, because that would give us more revenue. So if anybody is out there from the federal government or state government that wants to help us with that, that's coming down the road. I like to talk about the three-legged stool, and that is private, government, and nonprofit. If you're going to do anything, you have to have all three at the table or the stool, because everybody's going to bring different resources, perspective, and energy to solve for problems and have creative solutions. And then finally, the reality. So this is just since I took office a year ago. The government shut down. What does that mean? Oh, there's nobody at the visitor center at Arches. Well, what that actually meant for a lot of people that live and work in Moab is 2 missed paychecks. And there are a lot of people that depend on, they could go 1 paycheck, but 2, even if they're going to get paid later, that's rent, that's food, that's scary. Another thing that I experienced is the reservation system. And so we look at, again, the overcrowding at Arches. We need to solve for it. The impact on business. The impact on business is the same impact on the city in terms of revenue. And so it becomes really complicated. We want to support a reservation system, but then, we've got so much impact that we have to pay to manage. And then finally, just the reality of advertising funds that are spent by our state to continue to promote our areas. It really is a critical question that we ask ourselves right now, whether or not we're going to continue to pay for advertising instead of infrastructure. So that is a plea from Moab City, I suppose. But I want to say also how thrilling it is to be mayor. And so Garrett and others run for public office. because people said, well, gosh, you're the mayor. Well, how did you do it? How did you win? And I was like, I ran, I showed up, I participated. They elected me. How cool is that? So really, I can't underscore the importance of being involved. And if not mayor or council, then perhaps planning commission or other boards or services. So thank you so much.
All right, we're going to shift gears here a little bit. Oh, wrong place. All right. First, I have to say I'm really deeply honored and humbled to be among these other presenters. Some really powerful stuff. Steve, this morning was incredible. Vicky's presentation was great. As you can see by this slide, I've been asked to talk about recreational use fees. I was hoping to talk about rock climbing in Moab. But Professor Ruppel wouldn't have anything to do with it. Something about CLE and law school and needing to have a token lawyer on this panel. We have a lot to cover here, so I'm really going to rock on. I've also put together essentially a script to ensure I keep within my time frame and avoid the tyranny of the yellow cards. So forgive me if I seem wooden. And also I have thrown a few pictures in here to try to make this a little entertaining. All right, so this morning we talked about many tools to address recreational challenges on public lands. Reservation and quota systems, the Arches reservation proposal, regional planning to spread recreational use and dilute recreation impacts, the acquisition and development of new recreation resources. Recreation fees are certainly one of these tools. However, the importance of this tool is how it can be used to sustain agency budgets to employ these other tools successfully to address recreation challenges. I think in a sense it could be argued that recreation fees might be the most important tool of them all. My objectives in this presentation are threefold. First, describe some of the complexity, limitations, and issues related to recreational use fees. Second, summarize BLM's and the Park Service's fee programs in the Moab area. And third, briefly suggest how those programs might change in the future. Entertained? I hope, a little bit. As Rebecca mentioned this morning, the agency's primary authority to charge recreational users directly is the Federal Lands Recreation Enhancement Act, FLRIA. I'll be using that acronym, so pay attention. That authority applies to the Bureau of Land Management, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Reclamation, shout out to my reclamation attorneys, and Forest Service, shout out to Forest Service folks here, and Abby as well. The agencies have other laws that authorize the indirect charge of user fees through third parties, such as Park Service Concession Authority, as well as cost recovery, such as BLM's authority under Section 304 FLIPMA to recover costs for processing applications and preparing documents related to the use of public lands. I'm not going to be talking about that other group of authority. I'm going to just focus on FLRIA. And if I talk too fast to avoid the tyranny of the cards, just raise your hand wildly. Otherwise I won't notice. FLRIA authorizes 4 types of user fees depending on the agency and type of use. Standard amenity fees, which are generally for day use. Expanded amenity fees, which are generally for the use of campgrounds and specialized facilities. Entrance fees, and special recreation permit fees, or SRP fees. I'll be using that acronym as well. I'm going to focus on those 4 fees in a second here. FLRIA also authorizes interagency annual and lifetime passes. Those passes are certainly an important part of the fee revenue structure, but given the shortness of time I have here, I'm not going to be talking about those passes any further. I would like to note here that at this juncture, that FLRIA also imposes significant prohibitions on the agencies in exercising this fee authority. I will be touching on that. But let's go ahead and dive into these 4 fees. BLM, Forest Service, and Reclamation are authorized to charge a standard amenity fee, or again, a day use fees, only in very limited situations. The agencies may charge the fee for the use of an area, that's the word in the statute, that contains 6 specific amenities: develop parking, a permanent toilet facility, a permanent trash receptacle, an interpretive sign or exhibit, picnic tables, and security services. Now, Fleury doesn't provide any guidance as to what might be the acceptable size of an area. It could be 1 acre, 1,000 acre, 10,000 acres, 100,000 acres. This suggests that the authority to collect standard amenity fees for day use areas is very broad, but as we'll see in a minute, it is not. Now, agencies may also charge a standard amenity fee, again, those three agencies, BLM, Forest Service, and Reclamation, for national conservation areas, national volcanic monuments, and highly developed visitor centers. Those are unique situations. I'm not going to talk about those any further. The scope of an agency's expanded amenity fee authority depends on which agency we're talking about. For the Park Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service, the authority is quite broad. Those two agencies can charge an expanded amenity fee for, quote, specific or specialized facility, equipment, or service, end quote. Congress provided no direction as to what is meant by this phrase, so it's left up to the agency essentially to determine what uses qualify under that phrase. The authority for the BLM, Forest Service, and Bureau of Reclamation is much narrower. Those three agencies can charge an expanded amenity fee for developed programs with the majority of the 9 amenities shown there on the slide. Those three agencies, BLM, Forest Service, and BOR, can also charge an expanded amenity fee for 9 specific situations articulated in Fleury. For example, the use of boat launches, utilities and dump stations, rentals of facilities, and reservation and transportation services. I'm also not going to talk about those 9 situations any further due to my limited time. Fleury authorizes only the Park Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service to charge entrance fees for designated units. Interestingly, Fleury expressly prohibits the other 3 agencies from collecting entrance fees. As an aside, this raises the issue of at what point does an area day use fee become a prohibited entrance fee? All 5 agencies are authorized to collect special recreation permit fees, or again, SRP fees. The agencies may collect those fees for, quote, specialized recreation uses, end quote. Now here Congress did provide some examples, group activities, recreation events, and motorized vehicle use. But the bottom line is it's up to the agency to determine what is a specialized recreation use. In addition, Fleury's prohibitions, which I mentioned earlier and which I'll talk about here in just a second, do not apply to SRPs. In essence, this gives agencies far broader discretion to collect fees under the auspices of an SRP than any of Fleury's other fee provisions. You were entertained, yeah! With respect to setting the amount of a fee, the agencies enjoy very broad discretion. Fleury provides little guidance. It does, however, provide certain criteria. I won't go through those criteria, except to mention that the only criterion with any teeth is that any fees must be commensurate with the benefits and services provided. I also will mention that the Secretary must consider a number of other aspects to set a fee. The one I do want to flag for you here is that an agency must consider input from a Recreational Resource Advisory Committee, Recreation RAC, and the reason I flag that will become apparent in a minute. Thanks, Clif. All right, let's turn to the Fleury's prohibitions. BLM, the Forest Service, and the Bureau of Reclamation cannot charge standard or expanded amenity fees for only parking or picnicking alongside roads and trails that might be in a fee area, for general access unless specifically provided by Fleury, for recreating in dispersed areas with low or no federal investment in the infrastructure unless specifically provided by Fleury, traveling through a fee area with no use of facilities, using scenic pullouts or overlooks in the area, and in certain other limited situations expressly provided by Fleury, such as access to end holdings. The BLM, Forest Service, and the Bureau of Reclamation also cannot charge standard amenity fees day use fees, and the Park Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service cannot charge entrance fees to any person 16 and under for outings conducted for educational purposes, and to any person engaged in a non-recreational activity authorized under a federal permit, such as a grazing permit. Hopefully these last few slides have given you an idea of the complexity of Florida's fee provisions and suggest how it might be difficult for agencies to exercise this authority. To help drive that point home, it is worth noting here that Florida's prohibitions significantly limit the BLM, Forest Service, and the VOR to charge a standard amenity day use fee, except for very small areas with minimal access. In short, all these prohibitions create myriad exceptions that may make fee collection unworkable. Envision for a minute a large area with multiple access. A BLM employee might essentially have to interrogate the visitor as to her intended activities in the area to ensure that the day use fee could be lawfully collected. I think you can all imagine what kind of law enforcement nightmare that would be. The priest, coming down off the priest. Florida provides all 5 agencies with fee retention authority. Agencies may retain and spend fee revenue without further congressional actions, in other words, no appropriations. I got the tyranny of the cards, 5 minutes left, or approval. More importantly, perhaps, is that the fees have to be spent on the ground and no more than 15% can be used for overhead. Finally, Florida requires the agencies to publish guidelines for public involvement in setting a fee. Florida does provide, however, certain minimum requirements. For expediency's purposes, I'll just have you look at the points on the slide. Actually, I do want to point out one thing. One of those minimum requirements is that for BLM, the Forest Service, the agency must consult with the Recreation RAC for standard amenity fee proposals. Florida does have a provision that allows the agencies to rely on a resource advisory committee established pursuant to other law. And that is, in fact, the case here in Utah. Both the Forest Service and the BLM here in Utah have decided to rely on the Utah BLM RAC established under FLTMA. By the way, Clif is a new member of the RAC, so talk to him, as you might see later.
Even more pressure.
Yeah, you got it. Since its enactment in 2004, Florida has been amended a few times, but not significantly. As enacted, Florida included a sunset provision that terminated the agency's authorities in 2014, but Congress essentially annually has extended that sunset date, which now stands at October 1, 2020. And incidentally, that was done in the Public Lands Bill that included the Emory provisions, and Rebecca talked about it this morning and referred to it as the Lands Bill or the Dingle Act. There's a lot in that public law. I probably just shot 30 seconds of my time. But I gotta keep this up for a second. Those are my kids. But now they're big now. So let's talk about some select issues regarding recreation fees. I see these issues in 2 buckets. The first bucket is, should fees be charged at all? Critics argue that fees are an inappropriate tool to raise revenue as it amounts to double taxation, discriminates against low-income individuals. It's unfair to locals who are surrounded by public lands and don't have other recreational other recreational opportunities, and that other revenue sources exist. Critics also argue that fees are a slippery slope that will inevitably lead to reduced agency appropriations. In short, fees give Congress a way out. Rather than making difficult decisions how to spend taxpayer money to fund agency budgets, basically Congress leaves it to the agencies themselves to fund their own budgets through fee collection. Critics also argue that fee retention authority incentivizes agencies to construct more facilities at the expense of primitive or wilderness recreation. And the argument goes like this. Under FLURIA, agencies can collect fees only for the use of facilities. Agency budgets are dependent on fees. Therefore, if an agency's budget needs to increase to address recreation challenges, it has to build more facilities so it can charge more fees, thereby decreasing the primitive or wilderness recreational opportunities. The second bucket of issues can be characterized like this. If fees are charged, who pays and for what? Are there too many exceptions? I think Secretary Zinke touched on this last March in 2018 when he testified before the Senate. Quote, when you give discounted or free passes to elderly, fourth graders, veterans, disabled, and you do it by the carload, there's not a whole lot of people who will actually pay at our front door. What the Secretary was referring to were the various annual and lifetime passes available to the public, but I think his point applies across the board. Are there simply too many, I got 1 minute, too many exceptions? Who's not paying now that should? For example, should fees be charged for primitive and wilderness recreation to cover trail maintenance costs or backcountry ranger costs? Should fees be charged not only on government expenditures for recreational facilities, but also on the degree of natural resource impact, which incidentally is not provided in Fluria, and as far as I know, agencies don't really look at that as a factor. For example, should mountain bikes pay more than hikers? Oh, looks like I'm not going to be able to get to the agency's implementation of Fluria in the Moab area, so I think I'll just punt at this point. John, may I punt, or should I try to squeeze in a few more minutes? All right. So turning to, really quickly, bear with me here. Sally, forgive me for cutting, if I cut into your time. So let's talk about the implementation of the Moab area. In general, BLM's guidance indicates that fees are to be developed through business plans. The purpose of business plan is to give public notice of a fee program's objectives, to demonstrate its consistency with Fluria, and to provide public input. There are 4 Moab area business plans on BLM's website. I assume that those plans constitute or indicate the universe of fees that BLM charges in the Moab area. Excuse me, let me go ahead and catch up here so you can all pause there. So those are the 4 plans. I'm assuming that those plans constitute the universe of fees that are charged down there. If I'm wrong, Abby, perhaps you can tell me otherwise. Collectively, these plans show that BLM collects the standard amenity fees, day use fees for only one area, the 9,000 acre Sand Flats recreation areas just south of Moab. It collects expanded amenity fees for 45 campgrounds and 7 to be constructed. And it collects SRP fees for hundreds, if not thousands, of permits. For example, the business plans indicate that in 2012, fees were collected for 197 land-based commercial and private SRPs and 33 river-based commercial SRPs and 7,500 permits issued to individual boaters for special use. Park Service's implementation of Fluria is a little simpler. First, there's nothing similar to a BLM business plan to look at to determine the basis for NPS's fees. You kind of have to divine it through the net. Park Service collects entrance fees for both arches and canyonlands, as you probably all know. It collects expanded amenity fees for 3 campgrounds and associated group sites in both arches and canyonlands. And it also collects other expanded and SRP fees for special use and event permits, to hike fiery furnace, and to reserve overnight backcountry permits and private river permits in canyonlands. So with that, I think I'll end this presentation. I do have more if you want to cut into Sally's time. I thought that would not be popular.
Well, I think we have a few minutes left to take questions. So if I can get the panelists to come up here, and we have some questions from the audience.
I'll be looking at that on video again.
Hi.
Got through half of mine.
Or we could sing
That might be more entertaining.
in harmony.
Yeah. A lot of these questions are directed towards Mayor Niehaus, but I think they apply quite broadly, especially to all of the residents of Moab. So I'll start with this. Outside of direct funding, what kinds of resources and support? For example, planning support, capacity building, models and lessons from elsewhere. What would be most helpful to Moab and the surrounding region?
What would be most helpful to Moab right now? And there was the planning piece of it. I think a little more money, a little more time, a little more space to figure out how we're going to solve for our unintended consequences. And that could be in the form of relief from advertising. I know that some businesses get nervous about that, but it's a reality. And then also, I was sitting at the Chamber of Commerce just this week, Chamber of Commerce meeting, and they were strongly opposed, or many members were strongly opposed to the Arches reservation system. And then Kate Cannon just came out and said, all right, we're pumping the brakes. And at the meeting, they were like, well, what are we going to do? Arches is full. So it's like, well, you got to give some and take some and give some and take some so that we can have, so that the residents have an awesome, safe, authentic place to live, because that's where tourists want to be when they're on vacation.
Well, I would just say that one of the things that we are trying to do at Public Land Solutions is provide a forum for the conversation to figure out what is the best thing for the community to do. Because it is controversial when you say, please stop advertising, when we have something like 500 more hotel rooms coming online in the next 20 minutes. So, but I think that there is as you said, there's a big role for NGOs in helping figure out what is the best next step for Moab. And because the law requires that the transient room tax funds, the formula for that is set by legislation, it's a non-trivial thing to think, can we just use some of that money for infrastructure? So it's going to be a challenging feat of democracy to sort out some logical and programs that will in the end help everyone.
Yeah, I'd like to add that with the TRT and TRCC revenue, I agree with broadening the piece of the pie that's not actually for advertising, it's for promotion, which could mean advertising. But for me, the best way to promote Moab is to improve the product, which is largely the trails, motorized and non-motorized. And so I'm not entirely sure we would need to change state law in order to reallocate that. But I'm certainly not talking about all of it, because even to maintain your level of use, you need to advertise in order to replace the customers that don't necessarily come back. But if you're talking about a $3 million advertising budget, I don't think all of the $3 million goes to advertising, but basically you take 10% of that, and $300,000 would be a huge impact for trail conditions and their surroundings. I'm not sure it would be a huge negative impact on those businesses. And I have to plug the OHV specific sources of funding, because TRT is OHV and National Park and everybody. But we have the RTP Recreational Trails Program with $1 million into Utah for motorized trails and $1 million for non-motorized trails. That comes from federal fuel tax of OHV use. Then the state fuel tax of OHV use plus the OHV registration, that is the sticker you put on your bike. That generates $4.5 million that goes to state parks. Half of it, roughly, is law enforcement. And then the rest is split wintertime, summertime, trail work, education.
Thanks for pointing out another unintended consequence is a lack of law enforcement and EMS funding.
Well, yeah, and search and rescue.
And search and rescue, yeah.
And then the last one that's OHV specific, that's not actually going back to the trails yet, if anyone could help with that, is when you rent a OHV in town, you're paying 18.1% tax. When you do a tour, you're paying the basic 8.6% sales tax. And some of that actually might be going through TRT and these other things, but very few of it's actually going back to motorized trails specifically. And that, as best as I could tell after talking to some tour and rental people, is at least $1.5 million given to city, county, state, that in my mind, some of that should go toward trails, because these other sources I just mentioned that are going to trails, like the RTP and the state parks, it requires matching funds. And basically, the reason why I just belabored all of those points is because I feel like I've figured out how to actually make OHV riding halfway sustainable, but I don't have the scale to do it because my budget's $50,000 on a good year. But if it was $500,000, we would have Moab looking great, and that applies to all the forms of recreation. Thank you.
Right.
Yeah, let me just jump in here for a second. Just ask some questions. I mean, first of all, are folks advocating for a federal tax? Because the feds can't rely on state taxes, obviously, for income.
What I was talking about earlier is for campgrounds like on BLM or Park Service, that the state can collect a tax.
That would be interesting.
I know, it's so exciting.
Well, so
what do you think?
I don't know. There's another issue here, and it's been mentioned numerous times about relying on essentially donations. The federal government relying on donations, and I just wonder if that's a good idea, because wouldn't that incentivize Congress then to maybe cut back budgets even more?
Yes, I am afraid of that.
Yeah.
I mean, I believe in public-private partnerships, and they're great examples. The potash company Intrepid helped fund the bicycle trails that we built in Dead Horse State Park, and it doubled the revenue of that state park in 2 years. So there's great public-private partnerships, but it kind of comes back to, if this is a mainstream activity that benefits everyone in society to have protected public land and places to get outside, then maybe we should just all pay for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in order to try to avoid that pitfall, the emphasis needs to be on having all parties with skin in the game, so to speak.
I want to stick with hotels, because
Because they're so awesome.
Well, it fits with your earlier comments.
They're so exciting
and there's
to talk
great
about.
question. You talked about creating some breathing room for Moab to be able to slow down and develop this process and this plan moving forward. But as we just heard, there are 500 new hotel rooms coming online in the next 20 minutes.
Yeah.
How do we reconcile those? How does the city work with the private sector to slow some of this growth? It can't just all be put on the shoulders of the state or the federal
The city and the
government.
county just passed a 6-month moratorium. We're going through a very quick future land use plan process, and also our planning commissions to get to the bottom of this, to decide how and where we're going to zone and allow for future growth in the lodging industry, and what that is going to look like. Because maybe a hotel isn't so bad if it's like regenerative building design and has retail and daycare and cool stuff like that we need in Moab too. So we're going to go through that process. We're in that right now. And in 6 months, if you're recreating in Moab, stop by City Hall, and we'll have a casual iced tea on the front lawn, because I'll be exhausted. It's going to be a really exhausting process.
Okay. Can you comment at all four of you, on the dynamic and the challenges of working with different governmental entities, with different political objectives? The city of Moab isn't necessarily synonymous with Grand County. Grand County's views don't always coincide with state policy, and state policy is often very different.
Oh, actually, they always get along.
No. Okay, we'll move on then. Hypothetically, if they were to differ, what would your thoughts be?
It's interesting, because now that I'm a city employee, I've also been a state employee. I've been a federal employee. So many different types of bosses, and so many different management styles. But gosh, I don't know. I mean, are you asking about how we can all work together to solve problems?
I think the question is twofold. What are the challenges you experience as a mayor, and what are the opportunities you see to work across some of those philosophical
so
divides?
the challenges are the opportunities. So I took office, and everyone said to me, "Oh, you're gonna feel like UDOT and SITLA are these big beasts, and you're gonna feel really disconnected from the state legislature." So I was like, all right, well then I just have the opportunity to get to know them and to become more familiar with the people that are working in those sectors. But the other thing that we're looking at, so if the city passes a policy, we ask the county to follow. If the county's passing a policy, they ask us to follow. We've done that a few different times. That's been helpful. So managing our region collaboratively, but also really exciting to speak to is my new political bestie, the mayor of Price, Mayor Korenblat. And he is excited to transition. He works for PacifiCorp as a supervisor at the power plant. And so he recognizes that Carbon County and Price, they need to move through the energy paradigm and reshape what they look like. So we were like, well, maybe we could co-locate businesses to southeastern Utah, manufacturing in Price, research and design in Moab, and play together. The other thing that we all share in southeastern Utah is the inability to take public transportation to come up to cool conferences like this. If I'm going to come here, I'm going to drive. I could take the Amtrak, but if I want to go back to Moab, I have to be at the bus station at 3:30 a.m., which is complicated, especially if you're traveling with a 10-year-old. So we don't really have public transportation, so we've been working together along the 191-6 corridor to say, well, maybe there are things we disagree on in terms of public policy, but we definitely all agree on transportation, and let's start there and build friendships so that we can have gentler conversations about public lands use.
There was a great op-ed in the Tribune on March 10th by, and if I get this name wrong, Paul Jacobs, and he was making the point that one strategy that really needs to be seriously considered here in addressing recreation challenges was regional planning, broad-scale planning to move use around. And Vicki mentioned that the Tourism Bureau was doing some of that, and that seems to me to be intuitive. Like, well, of course, somebody needs to look at the big picture here. So the question in my mind becomes, well, who should it be? Should it be the state or should it be the feds? The feds manage most of the lands, but the state may actually have more budgetary flexibility and maybe more willingness to do that.
I think actually the state recreation directors are going to be able to play a really important role in this. And part of it goes to sort of letting go of that traditional, before we can talk, we have to decide what our shared values are. Forget those shared values and let's look for shared desired outcomes. And I think that there is a real opportunity. The state directors, I was on the advisory board for the first one here in Utah, and I've been involved with a bigger group that's working on the state directors around the country. And that is a weird thing, right? You create this job and you hire someone and they get a desk in the governor's office or somewhere nearby, and then they go, now what am I supposed to do? So one of the opportunities is the state directors have an opportunity to look at it from a regional perspective. They work with everyone involved, and I think at first what they started to do was just try to recruit companies from other states. It was like musical chairs to get the different companies to go from Colorado to Utah to New Mexico or whatever, and now they're realizing that their real job is much more about building a sustainable recreation economy. So I think that we do have some capacity in that office that could do just that, look at it from a regional standpoint. I just gave Tom Adams some more work.
Yay,
Where's
Tom.
Tara?
I don't really have an answer to it, but it's a good question because those decisions are best done when there's actually involvement and buy-in from the local, the state, and the federal, because it's federal lands in most cases. So, that's an important level of buy-in. But as you get closer to the community, then they're more affected and somewhat more knowledgeable by those issues. And oftentimes a bad decision is missing involvement from one of those three. And I mean, basic like collaboration and mediation tactics of forcing people to be in the same boat might help grease the skids, and that transportation, which I'm glad Emily brought up, because when we're talking about Moab, things like fuel consumption, it's pretty much happening when you get there. I mean, on your way there, once you're there, it's negligible. But it obviously requires multiple counties. Mm-hmm. And I mean, y'all would probably know better than me how to make that happen, but the working relationship needs to be there as Moab becomes less of an outpost and more connected. Hopefully that will happen. Thank you.
Okay, we're running a little low on time, so I'm going to close with a final question and give you plenty of time to respond to this. But Scott Berry asks, if each speaker was all-powerful and could start from scratch to manage recreation, what would be the first thing each of you would do to manage those challenges?
I'm just a lawyer. I'm sorry. I'm not a policy person.
All powerful?
All powerful.
You just got promoted to be the queen of Moab, not just me. Okay, here's what I would do. I really believe in this managing experiences, not just polygons, is a really important part of the process. So when you look at trying to create a sustainable, well-planned, well-executed recreation economy, and what you have to do is think about, okay, who is the customer? You do have to put the business lens on it. Who is the customer? What are their expectations? What is the experience that you're trying to offer them? And if you do that well, which many communities, Monticello, just saying, have the opportunity to do, where if you started and really thought through what is going to be, how many hotel rooms do you want? What is the zoning for those hotel rooms? You could do the sort of city planning to match the public land recreation opportunities. I mean, San Juan County could be the Machu Picchu of North America in a sustainable way if it did the right type of planning. So if you look at what are the experiences, we need a short experience for people with kids. We need a longer experience for more experienced visitors. But if you did that experience planning, then you could generate some, by definition, you're going to know what can the volume be. If this is the experience you're trying to sell, then you can't have 10,000 people on the trail at one time, because that's degrading the experience. So I think there is an opportunity to use that framework to plan something that would work better and be more sustainable and still allow people to get outside and protect the resource and drive the economy.
Yeah, if I could just dabble in policy for a minute. On Rebecca's slide this morning, Rebecca suggested a commission. And I forgot the name you put on it, Rebecca, but basically try to get a handle on this, get the best and brightest together, because it's, from my perspective, having researched this for a couple months now, we're all over the place. There is no coherent national recreation strategy. So I think that if I were all powerful, I'd make that commission get to work.
Good idea.
You're wisely going last.
I am.
So you can,
I am.
Counter whatever I come up with. No, I knew Ashley would go first because that's what makes her effective. She knows exactly what she's asking for. But I'm thinking that the security of access is a component. It's always a concern for OHVs, and maybe it always should be a concern because to some degree, you know, when there's a threat of losing a trail, maybe it'll incentivize people to actually maintain the trail. But there's sort of a fine line there, because at a certain point you might just throw up your hands and say, you know, this trail work is actually making the area in better condition to be more eligible for other, quote, protections that might actually work against the access. And I'm not looking for guarantees, but like the Emery County bill is a huge ball of wax that I couldn't possibly do justice to. But one of the big concerns that I had with it was that it didn't even give leverage really beyond using the name recreation in the area of the 200,000 acres in the middle of this well. It didn't give leverage to defend access, and whether that means somehow reforming the Antiquities Act to its original intent, and I know these things they're not going to pass Congress very easily, but just please recognize that that dynamic, you know, when I'm trying to make conservationists of other OHV riders, and meanwhile there's all these things in the news about bills and monument proposals, it makes my work seem sort of you know, like it should be pushed to the back burner. And so that would be part of my wish list, along with you know, the proper funding for the conservation work and everything else. Thank you.
I'm ready to answer. If I were all powerful, I would make sure that every single one of us takes care of ourselves, that we take care of our family, that we take care of our community, that we talk to one another, that our communities are talking to our neighbors, that we are treating the planet with respect, that the fences we build are fences made from the trees that are cut down, that are regionally available, that we sit down together and we decide, oh, your recreation is this type and mine's that type, and let's do it at different times, and let's be sure that we pick up after ourselves, and that we all, if we start in a place where we love and care for ourselves, that it'll radiate into the way that we manage our public lands, and that most importantly, those public lands be inclusive and accessible and managed with love. That's what I would do with my power. Good job.
Well, that's a great note to close on, and right now we'll break for about 30 minutes and come back for a conversation with Sally Jewell, the former Secretary of the Interior.
I can't believe, like, Sally's going to be right here.
Yeah. I told you. Yeah, I wish we had more.
I got real deep just then.
Oh, that's
Nice to meet you.
that was
You did a great job.
a good way to wrap it up. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That was great. Sorry, you were getting so many questions.
Oh,
In a good way.
tough one.
That's what happens when you
It's
give it
basically,
If you want to email me those questions, I can attempt to answer them and send them back to you to distribute.
Well, we have a calendar.
I'll send you the questions.
They might be really short. The truth is, like,
I don't know. They're not attributed to anyone individually. They're all attributed
Yeah.
to council.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't know.
Yeah.